Thank you for inviting me back. It's so good to be here in my first UU home for 29 years, so I do feel at home here. I begin by sharing a story as related in the Boston Globe about Rabbi Howard Coomer, who spent years guiding others through wrenching life and death decisions. As a hospital chaplain, he ministered to patients tethered to life support machines. He told his wife he never wanted to be kept alive that way, but surprisingly, he never prepared any documentation. He never talked to his children about this. And at age 67, he had a catastrophic brain hemorrhage that left him near death. A physician suggested stopping treatment, letting him die. His wife supported this, but the children didn't. Two demanded more aggressive treatment to keep him alive. One disagreed. Well, ultimately, the rabbi's family did choose less intervention, and the family was not irreparably torn apart, as sometimes happens. The family put together a little ceremony which they had at his bedside, singing, praying, telling stories, in my opinion, a good way to die. Now, here is still more irony. The rabbi's widow admitted that 13 years after her husband's death, she still had not had an in-depth conversation with her children about her end-of-life desires, nor had she prepared any documents. Still more irony is that the widow is a former social worker administering to the needs of those with terminal illnesses. Why? Why do we as a society hesitate to talk so much about death, which a natural phenomenon we know we will all face? Why do we hesitate to talk to others about our end-of-life wishes? Sure, there's the human tendency to postpone what's uncomfortable, and I get this, but it should be more uncomfortable to do nothing. I understand that your theme for the month is reason, and sound reasoning dictates that we talk about death more openly. Surveys show that we do little to prepare, either by talking to others, expressing our wishes in writing, or even having the healthcare power of attorney. About 1 in 4 people, adults, have this, and many, many less have talked to their loved ones about their wishes. Perhaps facing a discussion of our end of life turns even a pessimist into an optimist who thinks there will always be time. But we all know that for many, regardless of age, this is not the case. In this talk, I want to convince you in this room that might not have the needed documentation expresses your wishes. Do this regardless of your age. Talk to those around you about your desires regardless of your age. I also want to persuade you to talk to your loved ones and, well, any other family members you have. We all have that, don't we? But talk to them about doing the same. And I know many of you have already done this, and I hope you will not decide to take a little nap then, because I want to persuade you to join me in becoming an evangelist for this cause, and I want to give you some ammunition for this. And last, I want to talk to you about what our faith teaches us that's helpful when it comes to facing death. First, I want to discuss why talking to others and having needed documentation is more important than ever before. You know that modern medicine has deeply altered the course of living and dying. You know we can be kept alive much longer than was ever possible. And in general, this is a marvelous thing, but it has a downside. In the book, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End, the author and oncologist Atu Gadwadi discusses what he calls the seemingly unstoppable momentum of medical treatment. Remember this, the seemingly unstoppable momentum of medical treatment. Gadwadi writes, the waning days of our lives are often giving over to treatment that addle our brains, sap our bodies for a sliver's chance of benefit. They are spent in institutions, nursing homes, and intensive care units. We have allowed our fates to be controlled by the imperative of medicine, technology, and strangers. The fact that we may be worsening the time we have left hardly seems to register. According to the medical researcher Eileen Crimmins, healthcare hasn't slowed the aging process as much as it has slowed the dying process. So dying has been elongated, and it is now considered one of the stages of life. So we live longer than our parents, but we're much more likely to end up living and dying in a nursing home or dying in a hospital intensive care unit. Despite the wonderful work of hospice, most people will not die at home, even though surveys clearly show that's what most of us want. Most will not get the wish because dying has become institutionalized. Now, this talk should in no way be taken as a bashing of physicians. At one point in my past, I was in a devastating car wreck, and I was so fortunate to have physicians who did all they could to save my life against all the odds that I would not survive. It was their goal to do one more thing, to try something else when something didn't work, and I'm grateful. I want doctors that will do this. But I also want realistic doctors, and I am grateful for a physician my 87-year-old mother had who told my family that, yes, there was one more thing he could do to keep her alive. But if he were successful, he said he was sure she would end up with limited abilities, living in a nursing home, or at home, not getting out of bed, something she definitely did not want. My family was fortunate in this case because, at least according to Gadwadi, it's rare for a physician to be so forthright. He writes, there's always something else that can be tried, or almost always, no matter if the cost is a warehoused oblivion in an institution. Now, we know one major reason for some physicians' decisions is the real threat of lawsuits. And who can blame them when the stakes are so high? They could lose their license, hospital privileges, not to mention the financial repercussions. And we can help our physicians by having that needed documentation and by talking to family members. Let's say there are 3 adult children around the bedside discussing whether to try one more procedure to save their 88-year-old mother. And 2 say, enough, time to stop. The 3rd insists on trying. Well, if the procedure is not done, you know a lawsuit is a real possibility. So I'm not nearly as hard on physicians as Gadwadi is on his fellow physicians. We all know that there are changes that need to be made in medicine and the law, but that's not the problem I'm talking about today. No, the problem I'm discussing is that we are the ones not doing our part in this medical bargain. We and our loved ones, not strangers, should be making these wrenching life and death decisions, no matter how difficult. Listen to these 2 examples of what happens all too often when people have not expressed their wishes and take control. And I mean express their wishes directly, strongly to those around them. A 35-year-old woman was dying of painful ovarian cancer which had spread throughout her body. She'd been told that she had a few months to live. She developed pneumonia and was quickly given an IV antibiotic without being asked. Even though the pneumonia not treated would surely have been a less painful and a quicker death, something she wanted but had not voiced to others. An 87-year-old man who lived alone with no close family developed a serious heart valve problem. One of his greatest fears was having to leave his home and go to a nursing home. Yet he was immediately scheduled for surgery to correct the valve problem, which left him weak and unable to care for himself. And he spent the last 6 years of his life in a nursing home with no family and few friends. I'm not saying these medical decisions were good or bad. That's not my point. My point is they were not the ones the patient wanted. And I'm not blaming the doctors here. The patients or family members have to be the one to take this responsibility. Each person should be the one to decide when a choice is to be had, and the choice will vary. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, in a highly controversial Atlantic article, declared that he hopes to die at age 75, because in his opinion, that is when productivity, creativity, and originality are pretty much gone. It was controversial. So he, when he wrote this article, was 57. So he says when he's 75, he will no longer have any medical tests, take antibiotics, nothing. And of course, there may be a few of us in here thinking, well, when he's 75, we'll see what he thinks. Well, while I don't agree with Emanuel at all, because I know many 80 and 90-year-olds who are happy and lead meaningful lives, even if they're not as creative and productive as they used to be. But still, if this is what Emanuel wants when he's 75, that is his choice. Just as it was science writer Stephen Jay Gould's choice when he was dying and wrote, "For most dying situations, I prefer the Marshall view that death is the ultimate enemy, and I find nothing reproachable in those who rage mightily against the dying of the light." And he did rage against that dying of the light, and that was his choice. We all need to have a very serious discussion, first with ourselves, and then with others, about what level of being alive is acceptable to us if we are seriously ill and the future is not very promising. Gadwani tells the story of a friend of his who asked her elderly sick father this: "What level of being alive is acceptable to you?" The father's reply surprised her, for he said, "If I could live at home, eat chocolate ice cream, and watch football on TV, it would be enough for me to go through a lot of pain." This surprised her because she'd never known him to watch football on TV. But then he said, if there's a good likelihood, if the odds, and that's what we're usually dealing with, the odds, if the odds are that I will end up in a nursing home, then no, I do not want any aggressive treatment. His choice. Well, it's his choice and our choice, provided we've expressed our wishes in writing in a way accepted by the laws of our state. You know, you all need to have the medical directive or living will specifying the kind of care you want if you have a terminal disease. You know that, but surveys show, again, that only a fourth have done that. You know you need to pick someone and an alternate to have medical power of attorney in the event you're not able to make your own decisions. Instead of having separate documents, you can put this into one. The state of Georgia and South Carolina recognize a very excellent document called the 5 Wishes. In this, you detail what medical treatment you want in the event of a terminal illness, the person you want to make medical decisions if you can't, your wishes on how comfortable you want to be in what circumstances, and other things you want your loved ones to know, such as your preferences for a memorial service. In an insert in the order of service, I've provided information about where you can find the 5 Wishes document and much more information on their website. Now I want to share some of a personal story with you, since it illustrates what Gadwadi called, remember, that seemingly unstoppable momentum of medical treatment, and it also illustrates that importance of having a healthcare power of attorney. My husband died in December of 2012. About a year and a half earlier, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And about 3 months before he died, he began to experience dizziness and blackouts. It took about 6 weeks to learn that he had a heart arrhythmia, which we were told could be quickly fixed with having a pacemaker. And when he received the diagnosis, he was in the hospital at the time because of the blackouts. His cardiologist, who knew Bob had Alzheimer's, immediately scheduled him to have a pacemaker implanted the next morning. I didn't sleep that night, knowing that the pacemaker would extend his life and knowing that this is not that Bob wanted to continue living as the Alzheimer's grew progressively worse. He had a medical directive, but the situation wasn't covered by it, but I was his healthcare power of attorney. Well, the morning of the surgery to implant the pacemaker, I went to the hospital to talk to him, and I found him to be the most lucid I had seen in months. With no distractions in the room, I was able to focus him, have a serious, in-depth discussion about his wishes. He was clear. He wanted to die with as much dignity as possible. And I already knew this. We had had such discussions in our 43 years of marriage. I called his nurse. I told her to cancel the surgery. She was surprised, very opposed, and argued with me for some time. She immediately contacted the doctor, and he tried as forcefully to talk me out of the decision, and I had to remind them that he had Alzheimer's and I had his healthcare power of attorney. Well, it might seem like an easy decision since we know the devastating effects of this disease. Who wants to end their lives not knowing the name of their loved ones, in diapers, having almost no control over your body? Well, but the decision wasn't so easy because I was worried that Bob would black out, fall, break a leg or a hip. But in spite of this concern, we left the hospital without the pacemaker and over the strenuous objections of the doctors and nurses. A few days later, I took my husband to the cardiologist to see if there was just any medicine that he could take that might help with the blackouts. And while there, the cardiologist, the nurse, pacemaker technician all tried to persuade me to have the pacemaker implanted, which they said they could do the very next morning. Really, they badgered me, and they looked at me as if I were a murderer, and I understand I was to them. But I also knew that I was doing what Bob wanted. Well, this example illustrates the importance of assigning that healthcare power of attorney. If I had not had that document, Bob would be alive, I suspect, and in late-stage Alzheimer's today. Instead, he died at home with his daughters and their family and me at his side, sharing stories and remembrances, having a toast to a life well lived, laughing at some stories, a good way to die. Another example, which some of you will know, but it bears repeating. Some of you are old enough to know this tragic case of Terry Schiavo, who had no written documentation about her end-of-life preferences. She collapsed at the age of 26 due to cardiac arrest and suffered massive brain damage. After 2 months, she was officially declared to be in a persistent vegetative state. Her husband petitioned the court to remove her feeding tube. Her parents opposed this. In several court trials, the husband testified that she told him she would not like to have life-prolonging measures if she were in such a state. But she put nothing in writing. She had not talked to her parents about this. After all, she was only 26. A long legal battle ensued and involved 14 appeals, 5 suits in federal courts, and do some of you remember this? Even the President of the United States and Congress got involved creating a law just for her, insisting that she be kept alive. 15 years after she collapsed, her husband won the last court case, and the feeding tube was withdrawn, allowing her to die. We do not have control over a lot in life, and having that necessary paperwork is one thing we can control, and it's a beautiful gift we give our loved ones, and talking to them is another gift. We may never need this paperwork. It's a gamble I'm not willing to take, and I hope regardless of your age that you're not either, for we all know that tragedy visits the old and young. And again, if you've already completed that paperwork, I hope that you will see to that others around you, regardless of their age, have done the same. Now last, let's look at how does our faith help us face dying. Reverend Bill Schultz, former president of the UUA, once said that the test of a religion must be how it helps people deal with death. But we can't give others any assurances that a personal God will take away the pain. We can't promise each other that we will see our loved ones after death. So is this where our faith is lacking? Well, not for me. The Reverend Forrest Church, one of the most respected writers on UU thought, wrote his last book as he was dying of cancer. And in the book he wrote, death is certainly not life's goal, it's life's terminus. The goal is to live in such a way that our lives will prove worth dying for. He writes, about life after death, no one knows, but this we surely do know. There is love after death. The one thing that can't be taken from us is the love we give away before we go. This lives on. And our faith teaches us that the key to immortality, and we do believe in immortality, that key to immortality is living a life worth remembering. If you've ever seen the movie Tuesdays with Morrie, you'll remember that it's about a dying professor and his relationship with a former student who is so uncomfortable with even the mention of the word death. He does not want to talk about it. And Morrie's open discussion about death changes all of this. In the film, Morrie says, learn how to die and you'll learn how to live. The very acceptance of death helps us to become much more intentional, thoughtful, active about what we want our lives to be, as well as our death. In conclusion, I wish to summarize part of a sermon titled Graceful Death by the Reverend Ann Hines. She stresses that the way to deal with death, our own and our loved ones, is not to defy it, acknowledge it, talk about it as a natural part of life. The religious response, she says, should not be to keep death at bay. The religious response must be to help us as a community live life as fully as possible. And then when the time comes to let it go, to help others let it go with as much grace and dignity as possible.